we're with the San Francisco Bay Wildlife Society. We are the nonprofit friends group that supports the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge, as well as other refuges in the San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge complex. So, as a separate nonprofit, we are fortunately able to continue our work even during this government shutdown. And, we intended to have this in person at the Alviso Environmental Education Center at the refuge, but with the shutdown, thankfully we were able to pivot to making this a virtual event so we can continue to share the fascinating history of Drawbridge. And so our presenter for today is Ceal Craig. Ceal is a longtime volunteer with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service supporting the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge. She's been a board member with us at the San Francisco Bay Wildlife Society for a number of years, so she's been very involved. And her background is actually in engineering, so she's involved with a number of organizations supporting engineers, such as the Society for Women Engineers. She is also the author, one of the authors of the book Sinking Underwater. So this is Sinking Underwater, A Ghost Town's Amazing Legacy. So that is the book on Drawbridge. So she is our resident expert about this historical town. And we're really excited to have this talk and share information about it. So Ceal, is there anything else that you'd want to add?
No, I'll go from there. So,
Okay, we'll go ahead and have you take it away.
okay. So as Serena said, I'm an engineer. I always caveat this. I'm not a biologist or a naturalist or an historian, but I am an engineer that turned researcher. I decided to go back to school in my late 50s and got a PhD in education. And I'm not going to go into that here, but I became much more of a researcher. And at that time, then Anita Goldwasser, who is one of the pictures is shown here, she's a photographer, travel guide writer. She was in her early 90s when we started working on this. She's since passed away just 2 years ago. And she had always wanted to write one because she took a photography hike or whatever there back in the 70s. So some of the pictures in the book and in here are from her in that time period, which was just when Dot Edwards was being formed. So anyway, in 2000, I started volunteering when I retired the first time for Fish and Wildlife in 2000. And about 2008, a woman who had Anthony, who had been doing this program, was leaving the state and retiring, and I picked it up and ended up doing it and have gone through all the archives that Fish and Wildlife has and a lot of other research in museums and stuff, and have become sort of a de facto expert for Fish and Wildlife on Drawbridge. So I'm going to talk about the history, people, future, do a little virtual tour, which is what I do a little differently when we do it in person. So on the top left was a picture I took in 2010 when we could still drive around A17. And I'm going to show you some pictures to show you what I mean by A17, but let's just call it's the name of a pond that's on the south side of Coyote Creek. Drawbridge Island and its marshes around it are directly opposite. So it's the last view before we closed to the public on September 10th. And then, as I said, the Drawbridge cabin from circa 1977 when Anita took it. And here we go. All right. So this is a shot looking to the south. So it's kind of on top of the North Bridge. And I'm going to always try to orient you where you are. Up in the top right-hand corner, this is A17 Pond, just to the left of the railroad track there. And this is where the viewpoint is that you can normally get out to. Okay. And this is looking at it and what the buildings were still there in 2007. Not a lot has changed. Most of the pictures I've seen that Chris Benton, I'm going to explain that in a second, shows similar buildings in many ways. There were a lot more at one time, but this is kind of where we are now. Chris is a retired architecture professor from UC Berkeley, and he got into digital kite photography back in 2000 when I first met him back then, when digital cameras were small and just getting started. And so he would put it on a kite, it's pre-drones, kite, and he would fly kites. So if you look for his name, it's an unusual spelling, you'll find that since he's retired, he's gone over the world with his kite And it's kind of a non-invasive, easy way to do that. He has to get a special use permit anyway to go on the refuge to do this, but we have some wonderful photographs from him. I'm going to talk about what South Bay was like, life was like in the 1800s. Talk about the trains and bridges. I'll try not to wax too enthusiastic on, I'm a mechanical engineer on the bridge part. And then show you some maps, talk about what life was like, and then some characters, talk about the future. And then we'll go and we'll look at some of Chris's photographs, and I'll put the links in chat at that time that will give you a picture of what has happened since then. But this is an aerial photograph from 1928. And I originally got it from the South Bay Restoration Project site. But US Geological Service has a lot of this kind of overhead shots that you can look in their database as well. So the thing at the top right, kind of like a little duck's head, that's Drawbridge and Station Island before the ponds were actually put in place. So none of the ponds that we might see out there today, whether they're replaced or not, it all looked like this, like marsh. And down there in the bottom, kind of left of the photograph is the Port of Alviso. So that gives you a feel, and we'll talk about that some more as we go. So some top level statistics. Less than a mile long, about 80 acres in size, considering the marsh, etc. And smaller than a small farm. I grew up in the Midwest, that would be where it would be from. Demographics, 1887 is when the bridges were first completed, one at either end, and with a 2-room bridge tender's cabin that had to be there to staff it and convert these bridges so that boat traffic could still occur. By 1906, there were 79 cabins, 2 hotels. Then by the mid-20s, it got up to 90. That was kind of the peak in terms of any kind of population. Then electricity arrived, but things really started to decrease, and I'll talk about that. Water levels started to drop, and then by 1976, a couple years after Don Edwards Refuge is formed, then 1 resident remained. So this is that same view to the south towards Alviso, but it's taken at a, let me back a second. It's taken in the spring, so similar time frame, but 3 years later. And about this time, we've started to see really changes back from ponds to marsh on either side of it, which we'll talk about. This building on the left is what I call my bellwether building, and it's one you can see from the viewpoint. And whenever I go out there, whenever I have an opportunity to go out there, I always take a photograph to try to see what's happening and what changes are occurring over time, different seasons and so forth. So let's talk about the early years. Well, life in the 1800s was, I'm sure if you grew up here, you went through the California school system, or if you moved here and have gone to like the History Park Museum in San Jose, downtown San Jose, just south of 280, you can learn that South Bay area was an area breadbasket. It fed the miners in the mid-1800s in San Francisco and out to the mountains. Alviso was very much a working port. Fruit trees were everywhere, Blossom Valley, Blossom Hill, those come for real things. I remember when my husband and I moved here in 85, there were still quite a few orchards still around. Along where I live, along Hofstadter, there were quite a few. Those are all gone now. It's now a 6-lane, etc. But 100 years ago, 140 some years ago, South Bay was definitely an area of breadbasket, a lot of fruit trees. So there were 3 sail and steam lines that ran of Alviso, but by the 1920s, passengers and freight had moved in and railroads had started to go there. Landings were all over. Dixon Landing, which is along 880 on the East Bay side, that was a landing. And there are others, Mayhew Landing and a variety of others. But there was a lot of ducks that used to come through here, and they still do, though not as many as they did back then, along the Pacific Flyway. And Station Island became a good duck hunting place. But then railroads entered the landscape. So the town began with these 2 guys who are colloquially known as Slippery Jim Fair and Hog Davis had a vision. James Fair was a politician. I don't know why he was named Slippery Jim, but that's what I've been told he had. And Hog Davis, or Alfred Davis, he owned a meat packing plant in San Francisco. So these, I can think of them. They're 2 young guys, entrepreneurs, and the other entrepreneurs that maybe a little further along had just finished building the railroad across the United States, met Promontory Point, the whole thing. Well, the western part of it was driven by four men in California, Stanford, Hopkins, there's a variety of, I can't remember all of them, but they were involved. And so these guys were thinking, well, hey, we could do this on a smaller scale. So what could we do between Newark originally? And so they actually helped plat Newark as a town and Santa Cruz. They would build this narrow gauge railroad down the East Bay, interestingly enough. Now, when I looked into it at that time, there really wasn't any passenger freight coming down the peninsula either, though the big four were looking at it. So these two guys focused on the East Bay. The problem was, the biggest part of it was to get to San Jose, they could come along the bay, but then they had to cross all these sloughs, and there was these two waterways that had become fairly important. So in this map here in the upper right, Station Island's there in the center, that duckhead look, and there's Mud Slough and there's Coyote Creek. And Mud Slough went up to Dixon Landing, Mayhew Landing, and the gist of it is these two particular waterways actually had a lot of boat traffic. So how could they get across the railroads? Well, the bridges had to move. So the solution was they would build two swing bridges. They were never drawbridges that went up and down like this that you typically see. They were always swing bridges where there was a pier and it would swing like this, okay? So they've always been that. And when I looked into the history of why things are called drawbridges, long, long ago, that class of bridge often was called a drawbridge, even though the way we think of it today, it wasn't. Okay. So San Francisco to the South Bay and beyond, to get to Santa Cruz, and before this all happened, you could go by stagecoach, take 9 hours, or you could go by boat and carriage, but it took a lot of money and it took a lot of time. That was just I think, to San Jose. To Santa Cruz, it would take 2 days, cost more. So to get through Drawbridge, the idea was steamboat and train. South Pacific Coast Railroad is what it became known as. And it took 3 hours and 55 minutes and only cost $3.50. So proportionally, these are the same times. It was about a tenth of the cost and about half the time. Actually, less than half the time. So originally it was a narrow gauge, and the Drawbridge station was named and added in 1897. But the bridge actually the railroad started actually with passengers in 1876. And then 1906 to 1955, during that time period, it went to standard gauge, replaced the wood bridges. Coyote Creek stopped being a swing bridge. It became just a truss bridge like it is today. And then by 1955, they stopped regular stops at Drawbridge, but people that live there could still flag the train down to catch it or to get off. And today, if you go on Amtrak, Coast Starlight, or the Ace commuter train, you'll go right through there and you can see it. And freight trains pass through there daily. So the bridges of Drawbridge, originally they were a wooden swing bridge. Then they started having a little bit of metal. I'm sorry, they had an iron truss span, but it was hand operated. So think about this. It's this big crank operating everything, okay? But in 1904, they finally built mechanical bridges. And then in 1944, excuse me, 1904, in 1944, the trestle bridges were built. And so the Mud Slough Bridge, which is the second picture on the right-hand side in the middle, that's the Mud Slough Bridge today, and it actually is supposed to pivot in the center. I don't think it does pivot anymore, because when we were back more than 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago now, we're doing this restoration of ponds, certainly 10 years ago. And Cargill, who manages that bridge, were asked to pivot it so they could get some heavy equipment up to do part of this restoration, and they couldn't get it to pivot. So to my knowledge, I'm not aware that it pivots anymore, that they've even attempted it, but the bridge is still there and trains still go across it. The bottom one is the Coyote Creek Bridge, which is a stationary trestle bridge, and you can see that one anytime you walk up to the viewpoint. So the first bridge tenders, George Munderscheitz, I think I'm saying that right, but forgive me if I'm not. And he was the first bridge tender. That's him in the upper right. Had a hand crank movement, as I said. They installed motors in about 1910, just before World War I. But during World War I, there was rumors of sabotage. So they decided to have a 7 by 24 operation and added 2 more bridge tenders. And so they all lived in Drawbridge, and it was an engine crank movement. And then after 1940, it went into private ownership, originally Leslie Salt and then Cargill Salt when Cargill bought Leslie, and they used the Mud Slough Bridge. But on the bottom right, you can see circa 1903. This is from one of the Dowds families. This is the recreation. I'll talk about it later, looking, I believe, looking to the north. So this is a blow up of that original picture I had at the very beginning. So this was Drawbridge in 1928. You can, before the salt ponds were built on Station Island. You can see all those buildings. They're kind of in this top upper half of this. Then there's a bunch of stuff on the bottom. And then there's something in the middle here, and that's actually the Hot Sprung Hotel. The stuff on the bottom is South Drawbridge, and that's where most of the more permanent residents are, and the ones on the north were more seasonal. So at this point in time, there were about 90 houses with other structures, and 5 trains stopped a day. And a lot of times on the weekend, people would come out, enjoy the atmosphere, stay with friends, etc., doing hunting, fishing, boating, and swimming. In 1991, before my time with Fish and Wildlife, there was a volunteer, Paul DeLiban, who organized a bunch of volunteers who went out there and marked it all up and said, here's what the number for the buildings are, and here, and we have this whole list of here's the state of the buildings and everything. There's a much better graphic inside the book that we published. But it gave us a good starting point where a lot of things are. I've done a bunch of research on the plat maps available in Alameda County property tax things, and there are still a few plats. Plats is a word for the flat part of the land, the two-dimensional aspects of it. And there are still people that privately own those. And when they stop paying taxes, what used to happen is Fish and Wildlife would go in because no one can live on there or build on it anymore because it's part of the refuge since by law. So let me talk about the people and times. What was life like there? Well, by all accounts, by all the primary sources, all the primary interviews I've read that people who live there, grew up there, it was very much an independent spirits place. There were no police, there's no services. It's actually in Alameda County. Coyote Creek is the border between Alameda County and Santa Clara County, but it is actually closer to Alviso than to any kind of other suburb slash any kind of thing part of Alameda County. So Santa Clara County is the one that tended to go out there. But if there was a problem. In the upper right is a picture from, I don't know when the picture was taken. It appears to be 1970s from my memory of it. But anyway, it was built in 1876, and it was the second building built on Station Island. And the guy that built it, Gordon, shaped it in a railroad car. So you can kind of see that with the roof, but it actually goes kind of like an arc like that instead of peaked or flat. And it had ship bells in it, and he used to rent it. And so Paul DeLiban notes when they did the survey in 1990, one of the reasons probably it's lasted, and I think it's still out there, is it's out of redwood lumber and square nails. So that seems to be why it might have lasted so long. It didn't have a metal roof, which is interesting. So the one here on the bottom left is a picture of it from 2008. So the roof is gone, but you can still see the arch support and about the size of it. So the stories were it was a perfect spot to hunt and fish. I've read reports of smelt, striped bass, shrimp, and salt marshes were around the bay. Wildlife abundant, different times. Okay, different times. So winter living was very different than summer living. Winter living was duck hunting. So I've got some photographs here, period photographs for the gun clubs. And it was most of the women and children stayed home if they didn't live in South Drawbridge, and the non-residents kind of arrived to party and hunt. And so you can get a feel for it. You can see the water when the tide is high, it would show. So the only way to walk around is by these boardwalks they would build. There were no sidewalks per se, or pavement, or streets, or anything like that. The only street was the main railroad track, and then these boardwalks. but you can see the outhouse, and this one on the left, you can see the outhouse on the right side of the picture very, very much. And this is circa 1912. And then here's some boats up there with some ducks and fish and stuff. And the middle picture, I'll refer to them later, but that's the Burns family. So talked about them in a minute. So the Preceda, and I've seen a couple different spellings. I've seen Preceeta, and and I think that's more of a pronunciation because I believe it's Spanish. But anyway, it's Preceda and Thule clubs. So this is a Thule gun club. And the Preceda is there on the bottom left and right. And you can't see it too well, but the front part of the triangle part of the building is kind of fish scaly, and it was known for having this fish scale approach in a couple of spots of their siding. And then this thing on the right is not a phone booth, if anybody remembers what those used to look like, but it is a greenhouse. And it would be the one spot of color because there's not much color out there. It's gray, green, sparse, depending on the season. It'll be green, gray, green, gold, but it's not colorful. So they had a greenhouse where they had a little more colorful flowers they raised. In the summer living, it was mostly seasonal, as like I said, and so they had a lot of cabins that dotted across, but the seasonal ones tended to be in the north. A lot of times they're built on stilts, the wooden walkways, as I mentioned. This lower left one is still out there for sure, and it was originally owned by a dentist named Krumholtz, and those little openings you can see used to be a screened-in porch, and he would host ice cream socials. And it's really good because if you've been out there in the marsh in the summer, we get these little midge flies that kind of fly up into your nose, your eye, and various things. Because I could picture eating ice cream with midge flies would not be good. So screening a porch would be a good thing. And then the pictures here are Carrera's cabin. Carrera was one of the bridge tenders. And the bottom right shows, I believe, the north side of Drawbridge. So everybody had a boat in the summer in particular, in the winter probably too. And there are a couple of interviews that are actually from children that grew up there, that became adults later on. And they talk about what a great place it was to play. But there are a few that said, oh, it's nothing to do. Why are we here? Kind of typical kids' reactions, etc. But Lucille and George Salviatas, I believe they're brother and sister, but I'm not 100% on that. That's what I inferred from the way it was written, was they remember being there as children and what a treat it was to walk down about midway to the Sprung Hotel to buy candy. So it gives you a feel for that. So life at Drawbridge, kind of in summary, was outdoor people having a good time. They enjoyed themselves. Some of the earlier newspaper reports talked about these big divisions and cliques and stuff, but all I found from the research is that there was like a typical small town. There were different cliques, there were different backgrounds. The south side was mostly the permanent residents because they could then walk across the Coyote Creek Bridge to El Viso or catch the train and go to work. The north side tended to be more seasonal, a little more affluent. Had the duck clubs, the vacation cabins, they could afford that. They had other places they lived. But in general, what they did share was they loved the marsh and they enjoyed the freedom and everything away from things. They would get together periodically through the year and do stuff. So like, for example, in 1904, this is in front of the station actually, and they're all in dressed up like a party. And in 1904, my sister-in-law is a big history expert on costuming in these periods. And she was saying that's definitely the time period, because sometime after that, women's dresses went shorter and men stopped using the big collars and everything. And certainly hats changed a lot. But it gives you a feel for what it was like at that time. Let's see. So again, my conclusions from what I've researched is that the divisions did exist between North and South. Some of it was ethnicity and background. Catholics lived on the South side, Protestants on the North. The more recent Catholic immigrants were on the south side, the ones that have been here maybe a generation or so, English and Italian were on the north. But I think it was like many small towns, a distrust of people who were different. But they would still all get together for various things throughout the year. The narrow portion of the island, which had a little less slough access, had fewer residents, but that is where the hotel was. So just typical small town, but they had common goals. So let's look at some specific people. So John and Anne, her maiden name was DZ Burns. They actually spent their honeymoon out there. They got married. She liked to hunt and fish just as much as he did, and he built the recreation as it became known when he was courting her in 1903. So you can see them there on their honeymoon on the left, and what it looked like at different times. Now, the thing on the top right is the outhouse, but yet there's an outhouse further out. It's kind of interesting. Well, the outhouse didn't have any indoor plumbing. There was no sewers out there. The way the plumbing worked is you had an outhouse, and the holes were above the marsh, and the tide would come in twice a day and wash it all out. Okay. See, you can picture this if you've ever used one. I grew up by a lake and definitely used an outhouse. Always hated them. And when you had 600 people there or 6,000 people there, you could imagine what it must have been like in general, but that gives you a feeling. All right, so the boat and decoy builders, Billy Robinson is up there in the top right with his dog. And you don't typically see him standing. He had a physical affliction of some sort, but he was able to make a good living out there and building boats and decoys. So this boat on the left and on the right, on the bottom, gives you actually all three of them. They had a particular style of boat that had a very low draft, very short draft. And then it also had this big prow at the beginning flat where they could put mud to start with. They would go out there, keep balance. And then when they got a bunch of fish or ducks, they could throw the mud off into the marsh and put the boat ducks or fish on there, and then keep them in balance. But they were scull boats, supposedly a South Bay invention. Here's some photographs what it was like inside the cabins. Ed and Mary Dowd gave us these photographs, and they say they were I think their kids gave me this, and this is circa 1961. But if you want to put in chat, does anybody recognize what that white object in the upper right-hand corner is? That's not a refrigerator. You're on the right track, though. It's an ice box. Yes, Barb. It is an ice box, which is different. And I know growing up where I grew up in Minnesota, I definitely knew what an ice box was versus a fridge. But an ice box had ice blocks in it, and that's what kept everything cold. But it was an insulated appliance, but it didn't have any kind of Freon or Coolant or CFCs at that time. Now we use non-CFCs, but any kind of coolant, it didn't have that. But that's what they had out there, and they'd get ice and put it on there. And I could picture that. It's definitely 1961 circa. In the bottom right, there is an iron cook stove, a fairly small one. I remember spending my honeymoon in a cabin with a big one. It's the only way that he did it. A week before Christmas, -15 without the wind chill, northern Minnesota. But they're very effective, and then you can cook on them. On the bottom left, there was these bentwood chairs. Remember those, the tablecloth. If you grew up in this time period, some of this will be real familiar. So the hotel, the one that was there the longest, and because the other one didn't stay very long and kind of burned down. But the Joseph and Hedwig Sprung from Germany opened this in 1905, early on. And there is a paper we have in a binder inside the Alviso Environmental Education Center that shows that Joe deeded this to Hedwig in 1914, and then eventually to her nephew, Ike Oswald, in 26. And I'm not sure what happened to Joseph. I haven't been able to find an obituary per se, but I assume he either died or something. So but she ran this hotel for quite some time. So the dining room served hunters for 35 cents. She had some small bedrooms there. In the book, we have like a little layout of a sketch of what the hotel looked like a little area thing. And there was one bathroom, porch around the hotel and so forth. And she had an artesian well, and she supplied water to all the residents for $3 a year. So when she sold it to, or gifted it to Ike, her nephew, in 26, this is just about the time the Depression's about to start, he jumped it to $6 a year, which for some was a problem. And so the hotel didn't stay open during the Depression and onward. So it had its heyday for about, 25 years or so. And then in this picture on the bottom left, the woman in white, all white, that is Hedwig Sprung. On the far right, the very far right, is Ike's wife, I believe, who was a housekeeper, and she was a Loney, or I guess today we would say Tamiya Nation, but at the time, all of the primary material called her a Loney. So in the late 1920s, early 1930s, the Drawbridge population started to decline. You question why, what happened? Well, a couple things. Levees started being built for the salt ponds, marshes began to drain. So there was sewage coming in. San Jose and Newark were growing. There was no sewage treatment plant. There were just pipes that went right out to Coyote Creek and dropped that sewage in there to go out to the bay. It destroyed the slough, wildlife, ducks weren't as common and so forth. The Depression began, the hotel closed, the other lodge burned down. But the decline began by all accounts with the decline of ducks, which was one of the biggest reasons people came there in the winter. During World War II in 1950s, the Fremont, Newark area started really drawing water from the water table. So if you think of the artesian wells, the wells are going down fairly deep, and they're going down into what's called the aquifer. And I have to admit, originally in my head, I was thinking aquifers we're like this big lake underneath. Well, that's not it. They're down there in a very porous situation, and the water is able to be pulled out from that. Well, as the more and more fresh water was being pulled, much like we have seen during the drought years in the Central Valley, things started to drop and the wells ran dry. So when the wells ran dry, the only way to get water was by train. It would come out, they'd put it in these big tanks, and then they'd, like the hotel would push it down, right? So at that time, the North Bridge sinks 10 inches and 7 more inches by 1966. And then Anderson Dam was built in 1950 and slowed the Coyote Creek flow. So fewer than 10 residents remain, and in 1963, then in 67-8, the hotel was flattened by a storm. They took the train station down because it was getting too much of a liability. And then in 1972, Fish and Wildlife acquired the 23,000 acres in South Bay, which included Drawbridge. All right, so in 1960s, and this particular plea is actually from a letter I typed from it, and the woman who her aunt brought it to me, one of my first times doing this. And they wrote this: please don't break in the house. It's the only thing we have. These are on South Drawbridge, but they still broke in and everything was stolen. So more and more people left because there weren't enough people and there were too many folks coming in inappropriately and destroying things. Fireworks, they've heard of them abandoned. There were some newspaper reports that came out that said it was a ghost town, which it wasn't. People were living there, so people would come. So it became a little bit uncomfortable for a lot of people, and they just felt like they had to leave. Some characters there was like Nellie Dolan. She was there from 1900 to 1980. She lived from 1900 to 1987, and she left Drawbridge in somewhere around 1970, before 1974. But she moved there at age 10. She had a couple different homes. She has married 3 times, had two boys, and I do not have any pictures of her except in slacks. So I think of her as this independent woman. She worked all her life. She worked well into her 70s, is my understanding, before she finally had to move. And she knew how to use a gun. There's a story. She had one of her grandkids staying with her, and she could hear some people that were just coming in, and it was inappropriate. I don't know what to say, inappropriate behavior. So she got her shotgun out and she told them to get under the table, and she went out to the door and told them to everybody to leave. So she's known for stories like this. Charlie Lucci is the last resident to leave after the refuge was formed. He left in 79, about 7 years later. He worked for PG&E. He was a lineman, and he'd worked for them for 30 some years, I think. And he's got these Charlie isms that are there, that I put one down as a quote, and that his structure is no longer there at this point in time. But he began visiting in 1914, in high school, and he was born in 1914. So, all right, so let's look at modern times. Well, I got this recently. When did I get this? I guess 2016, 10 years ago now. Been doing this for a while. So Fred Landers was the older guy, Russell's his son, and he made this pencil sketch in 1976 when they made a visit at that point. And that's the two-story building. It's the best rendition I've found with a picture of the two-story building and the sketch. And then on the right, I believe on the bottom is the Presida, which you see those little fish scale, like little roundy things here in this pair. That's what I think we're referring to. In South Drawbridge, late 1900s, 1981, that's high tide. So you can see that two-story building in the upper right of the upper photograph. And these buildings, some of them, and I'll show you some pictures of them, we can see those, but most of these are gone. But this is where the permanent residents were. This is where they walked to Aliso for school or work. It's about 3 miles. And these bulkheads were built, and you can't really see them as bulkheads, but they were built to confront waters from Coyote Creek. And I'm guessing when Anderson Dam was built, depending on how they, let water go or something like that. South Drawbridge, this is ones I've taken from Visual Earth or Google Earth or something like that, or my own photos. And these buildings, I'm trying to point to where the buildings are. You can see the buildings appear to be close to the Coyote Creek edge, but they're actually further back. So 2011 versus photographs. North Drawbridge, this is early days. This is circa it's around 1906, because you can see two rails here. One of them is narrow gauge, the other one is standard gauge. And they took the narrow gauge out sometime after 1906. This is North Drawbridge sort of now. I should see if Chris has some better ones more recently, but this was 2009, 10, and 11. From fall, spring, early summer, but you can see the changes over time. The first one on the left is view to the south, like the original ones I showed you, and these other two are views to the north. So it's Mission Hills and Hayward up there to the top right. So for a while there, back in 2010, 11, and 12, we were renovating A16 and A17. And again, hold on the A16 and 17. I'll show you a map. There are no residents living. Oh, are they living today? That's an interesting question. I seriously doubt it, based on anyone who's been there. It's possible, but I'm not aware of any. So the Coyote Creek and Mud Slough met. So this is kind of the westernmost part. So this little peak thing here, and see, this is Coyote Creek coming along and going out to the bay. So on this right-hand photograph at the top, that's the Santa Cruz Mountains, Peninsula Mountains. So that's looking out that way. And then this one on the upper left is a photograph I took when we were doing the Drawbridge tours, because when we could go out there before the things started to happen, we would go out along the levees in a van and take pictures and stuff. But that's the convergence. So here's just some other photo. This is one of the best ones I found that Chris had of the Mud Slough Bridge, or Warm Spring, has different names, Mud Slough, Warm Springs Slough Bridge. So this is the Fremont Hills up in the top left there. And this is looking to the east, East Bay Hills. And that gives you a good picture of what the currently swing bridge that I don't think works anymore, but it still is a bridge. On the right-hand side, you just see some evidence of the building sinking into the marsh and over time, different times, 1990, 2006, and so forth. So in the 60s, we started to see a lot of subsidence. So one of the first times I did this talk in Alviso, almost 20 years ago now, 15 at least. One of the Alameda County Water Commission, Board of Water or whatever commissioners was there. And he was saying when he was young, he used to go around a boat around Drawbridge from the Irvington district. And he talked about what was happening was the thing I already talked about, where the water had started to go away, and then the wells started to fill with salt water. So the salt water started going in the aquifer. So things like Quarry Lake, a park in Fremont, there's some recharging pools along 101 as you go in Morgan Hill. But they started pushing fresh water down into the aquifer to try to put fresh water in the aquifer out to it. But for a time in the 1960s, 50s and 60s, the salt water went all the way out to Niles Canyon and actually filled the aquifer almost completely along the South Bay. So we can do our part to limit water flowing into the bay, and of course, from a drought prevention standpoint. But the future is brighter. The salt pond restoration project started in about 20, a little over 20 years ago. And it's in the process of changing these ponds from managed salt ponds to freshwater or unmanaged ponds, whatever. But this one isn't as visible as one I'll show you a little later. But here's down here, just below the legend, is the ponds on either side, that's Station Island. And then A17 and 16 in our Alviso, which is where we normally would be. Okay. So today, Drawbridge is sinking into the marsh. The picture above is from the viewpoint that we ended up, putting together after the access closed. South Drawbridge houses this water tower is still there. The last time I was out there a year ago, July, I think it was, we went out for Rocana's staff, was still there, and a lot of the buildings are still there. So we see avocets, that's what these are, or in the water tower there, or we see kites. My reference is kites like that take digital cameras that watch over Drawbridge today, so 2010. But the buildings are gradually decaying. So let me go into mercury mining. Do you want to talk to this one?
So, back during the gold rush, there was a lot of demand for gold and a lot of industry related to it. So at the time, mercury mining became a really big industry here in the Bay Area as well. So if anyone's familiar with Almaden Quicksilver County Park in South San Jose area, that used to be one of the world's largest mercury mines. And the reason why people were mining for mercury is that they would use that during this process of hydraulic mining. So they would go to the Sierra Nevada hills and basically blast the hills with this really high pressure water to extract the sediment from the hills, which is of course devastating for our mountains out there. But even worse, that we know now anyway, is that with that slurry of water and sediment, people would also inject mercury into it because mercury binds with gold to form an amalgam and that sinks. And so that makes it easier for them to extract the gold from these hills and from the sediment. They would eventually burn off the mercury, which they probably didn't know very much at the time, but that is highly, highly toxic, right? So a lot of that pollution is still in our bay today because from our hills where they were mining the mercury, as well as from the hills where they were blasting it into the hills, that is going to flow into our creeks and our rivers and eventually end up coming out into our marshes and into the bay because of the way that our watersheds work, right? Watersheds are areas of land where all the water flows to the same place. So anytime it rains, anytime they're using a lot of water, that's going to flow into our ecosystems and affect our marshes as well. So that mercury is still, to some extent anyway, in the system. And the mercury, that's why it's also, if you ever heard that it's not really safe to eat a lot of fish caught in the South San Francisco Bay, it is in large part also because of that existing mercury. So actions from, close to 200 years ago now are still affecting us today because of how our ecosystems are connected through our watersheds. Um, Anything else you want to add to that, Ceal?
No, that looks good. I was answering a couple of questions in the in the chat. Okay. So what we used to say is, let's go visit. We would take the van tour out there and we would go, whoops, we would drive up to this little spot right here. And then we would view this way. But we're not going there. Okay, so let me show you some things to look at. So virtual tour. So here's to provide Susan an answer to give you an exact picture, I hope. So this is 1899, and all of this black stuff is marsh, sloughs, tule, all these things, wetlands. That's what it was in 1899. But the bridge, I don't know if, I know it's hard for you to see, but the bridge is actually there. It had been built, but the marshes were there, no ponds. And so there's Mud Slough, Warm Spring Slough, Dixon Landings up there. This was Station Island, and that's Coyote Creek going down, 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 down to the right, and then to Anderson Dam. Okay, so that's what it was, about 100 square miles of wetlands in the South Bay. Then less than 100 years later, 90% of those wetlands were gone. They had been turned into ponds, salt ponds, to harvest salt. And it's really hard to see. I've tried playing with this sepia photographs, but the gist of it is a lot of these are ponds now. And then around here, there's a pond on either side. There's ponds here, here. They all have numbers. And so the only thing that was really left of marsh right around Drawbridge was, you see that black triangle where the green arrow is pointing to, Coyote Creek. We call that the Triangle Marsh, and it's kind of like old growth marsh. It's never been made into a pond. It's always stayed there. And so that's kind of interesting in and of itself. All right. So that's what happened over time. So then the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project began around 2003, and I think the first work started in 2006. But the idea is, on these 15,000 plus acres of ponds that were brought from Cargill Salt, that they would turn those back into freshwater brackish ponds, non-managed ponds, marsh, etc. And a lot of that stuff has happened. So, for example, this A6 has become tidal completely. If you go out there along the Alviso Slough and some of the boat tours that the Santa Clara County Parks does sometimes, some of it's become tidal habitat. The A16, this one here, like a little triangle, a little right triangle here, that's where the Environment Education Center is in Alviso right there. And that has become pond habitat. And A17 is being left because it has tidal influence in and out of Coyote Creek, is turning into marsh over time. A21 and A20 on either side of the Drawbridge proper, shall we say, that is tidal habitat and was opened up, etc. So when I first started doing this in 2008, I started taking Google stuff and snapshotting it. So this is what it looked like from, at that point, Google Earth, before it became just Google Maps, but Google Earth. And you can see Drawbridge there, and you can see what it looked like at that point in time. The ponds were still there, the marsh was still there. And then there were levees. And you can see A17 is here with its little islands here on the bottom there. Then 2010, some things had happened. The levees had been breached, actually. Let me back up a second. So the levees have already been breached here in particular. So in the left-hand picture on the bottom right, that's the top of A17. And it has not been breached at this point in time, 2008. But if we go here, this is a different image from, I think, Visual Earth at that time, was Microsoft product. So A20 had been breached, and A20 had started to go away from being a pond to marsh. A21 took longer. At this point, the A17 had not been breached. So we used to, here's the EC down here. We used to go up along here, and then we go along the side of east side of A17 and here, and then we'd go back down that way because you couldn't go across here. That's all changed. Can't do this anymore. So in 2012, on October 31st, I remember being there, we breached from Coyote Creek to the top of A17. And then a couple years later, we had those big storms, a lot of storms. And the following year, when I went back, There was such a change in A17 because of all the water. You could really, it had almost flattened a lot of some of it. It was very interesting. But A21 and 20 have now, at this point in time, 8 years into being breached and turning back into marsh, though the levees are still there. Okay. And A16, as part of the restoration project, they built all these little islands. And that's what you see. These 4 islands on the bottom of A16, which are right next to the Environmental Education Center, right in the bottom right where my mouse is. Those have been there since the pond was first built back in the 1950s. Okay, now I'm going to take us out of PowerPoint and I'm going to take you over to these. So Chris has all of his stuff out in Flickr, and it's really kind of neat. He always has a good description of what he did and when and what was going on, and you can read that at your leisure. But I'm just going to kind of go down through here. But this is after April 2013. This is right after the ponds have been restored. We put in this structure. It's a fish weir and water control structure between A17 on the top and A16 on the bottom. And so it just gives you a feel for it. And this is the breach. This is Coyote Creek, this middle one right here, the waterway going back and forth. That's Coyote Creek. This is the Hayward East Bay Hills, Fremont East Bay Hills. And this is where it breaches and goes in and out with the tide. Okay. So this was April. So the spring rains had stopped. You can see what's starting to have an impact. There's a little lower tide, so we could see things. But this is what the pond was starting to look like. And this is this one on the left. It says Salt Pond A17, this one right here. This is where the Drawbridge viewpoint is, and this is where he launched his kite from. So this is what you can see when you can go out there. But you can see different stuff. You get different impressions of what Drawbridge was like and where the bridges were and so forth. And you can look at this as your leisure. Okay. So that's April 2013. Now, if I go to July 2014, a year later, and in the summer, so here he's got much more building. So you get a feel for, here it is, it's up by the bridge on the north. And then here, this one on the right that's got the 4 buildings right here. This is the Krumholtz building. You can't really, we're looking to the south here. That's the Mount Amanum and Santa Cruz Mountains to the south. And yep. And then, so this is the Krumholtz cabin with the screened in porch, and this is some of the outbuildings. Those are still there, pretty good shape overall. There's other buildings here as well. And the little water tower, Witten's water tower, is right here. And let's see, so you can look through these and check them out in more detail, but he's got a lot more structural. Here's the Krumholtz buildings again from a different angle. Get a feel for what that, and this is the Mud Slough Bridge for sure. Okay. Then if I go to May 2015, a year later, so then they focused a bit more on what was happening on the biology here. And you get some fabulous photographs in terms of visuals and things of everything. So here's A16 with the newly constructed ponds, and they don't have as much vegetation on them as they do now, but this is 10 years ago. And you can see the different colors and everything that the marsh provides. This one is 2016. We're about a year apart on each of these. This is February 2016, and this one he focused on Station Island. And here is pretty sure that's the same Krumholtz building. I believe. I think I've figured that out, but I'm not 100% on that. But you can see the marsh is coming back in general, because A21 and 20, these are the salt ponds on either side of the railroad bridge. So they're not ponds anymore. They've become marsh, and the sloughs are still there and so forth. But you get a feel for what's really been happening. And here on the bottom right is a nice overview of here's Drawbridge at that point in time. This is February 2016. And here we are looking to the south, this one in the middle. Mount Santa Cruz Mountains, a little bit there, Fremont Hills, a little bit on the left. But these are and here's right in the center is our Krumholtz 4 buildings. And here's where the viewpoint is here, and that's Coyote Creek. So there you go there. Nice overview there. And then the 2017, you can see much more green. This is interesting since it's August. But you get, here's, looking for down, there was one here I thought had some of the buildings. Here's our Krumholtz building again. The structure is very easy to find, those 4. And then this is A19 and 20, which is on either side of Drawbridge in March of 2020. And it's the last one I pulled up here. He's done some more since then. You can look on his site, but there hasn't been as much change here. Here's our really nice overview of Drawbridge here. Again, looking to the south and so forth, etc. See where things are, Alviso there, so forth. Okay, so let me go back to this. Yep. And so here's the credits. I always try to give the credits where they come from. And then here's the book, Sinking Underwater. And if you're interested in purchasing it, let Serena know. I put her address here and email address, and then she could ship it to you. And if you want to receive the quarterly digital newsletters by email, here's a contact sign up. And then donating to the Refuge. So donating to the Wildlife Society so we can support the Refuge. All right. Any other questions?
Yeah, and as Ceal mentioned, I do have copies of Ceal's book, Sinking Underwater, and with the government shutdown, we're happy to take those online, any orders online, and ship those out to you. Normally, we would just have these in our nature store, but of course, we can't have those open right now because of the shutdown. So,
Mhm. Mhm. I'm looking at Mark's comment. I would love to have gone out there at that time. And I had that opportunity. My neighbor across the street used to be the volunteer that would drive the van tour. And they would go out to the railroad tracks and they would walk across. And then in the early 90s, the railroad happened to be out there and they saw them doing this. And they said, what the heck? And so they complained to Fish and Wildlife and they had to shut down those tours. So that's when they started doing just a program in the Environment Education Center or in Fremont. So. But then with COVID, we flipped to virtual, and so we've done kind of both. And then with the thing that's going on right now, which I haven't talked about, is there's a shoreline project that is raising, in fact, almost done, I guess now, has raised the levee on the south side of A16 has doubled it in size, and to get ahead of rising sea levels and to protect the infrastructure on the other side. The regional wastewater facility, which provides sewage and treatment and everything for most of the South Bay, and the infrastructure there in terms of the whole high-tech community along 237. Most of the networking companies are all along there and have their headquarters there. So for all these reasons, that's why we did that. But because of that, we haven't had access to the levees to take the van tour out to the viewpoint. We only did it in the summer, non-winter, non-rain months anyway. But hopefully we'll be able to get back into that maybe next year. We'll see. Good hope.
yep,
Okay.
stay tuned. And if you want to stay updated on future programs, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter or, check out our website calendar, and we always keep that updated.
Mhm. But Anita and I donated our time, all the proceeds from just the cost of publication, the delta that we sell it for, goes to the Wildlife Society that we use for the benefit of Don Edwards specifically in this case. As I don't know if Serena mentioned at the beginning, but we are the Friends group for all 7 of the refuges in the Bay Area for the entire complex. But we are overall for the complex as well as the main Farallones, Don Edwards, Ellicott Slough, and Salinas River, and the Veterans Lease Term Facility on Alameda Point. So,
All right. Well, thank you
okay.
so much, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. And we hope you have a great rest of your day. And hopefully, at some point when the government is back open, we'll see you in person.